Armenia is still reeling after Aliyev's major attack on the country's east and south. The Armenian PM has raised the death toll on the Armenian side to 135. As heavy as that is, many geopolitical and political maneuvers seem to be taking place. To discuss this, I'm joined by CivilNet host and analyst Eric Hacopian. Eric, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining me. Eric, there has been first off, a lot of confusion to do with Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's speech in Parliament 2 days ago, in which he said the government would be prepared to sign a painful peace agreement with Azerbaijan. This led to large-scale street protests in Yerevan, and later the PM, the Karabakh president, security officials all said that there is no peace agreement in the works. Some say Pashinyan contradicted himself in these two speeches. Others say that the speech was manipulated. So what do you think about this speech debacle?
Well, both of those accusations are correct. They actually did contradict himself. So on a day and a time when there's actually people fighting and dying at the border, he gets in front of Parliament and he's talking about this painful peace deal, which is the most horrible, just politically tone-deaf thing you could be doing. Forget about the morality or the wider principle of it. So yes, and then he comes back and he corrects himself. And obviously, some people took that his statement, leaving certain parts out, and made it more damning than it was. Because what he had done himself was damning enough. He really didn't need to do that. So yes, he caused a lot of confusion, and it was all his fault and his doing.
And then street protests erupted in Yerevan. This time, however, some are saying that these protests were different from the near daily street protests that were taking place this year. Were they different in your opinion?
Yes. First of all, we don't know the scale of it. I've heard different reports, partly because they were actually different gathering points. And then at some point they got together. It was very impromptu and it was very popularly driven. And I've heard numbers between 10,000 and 40,000 people. It's very hard to count, but this was significant. And this was not the usual opposition crowd. In fact, there were cases when people like Vanetsyan, who was the former national security chief, tried to speak. The crowd essentially booed them and wouldn't let him speak. And there were other figures from the traditional opposition that were essentially not allowed to speak because the people that came out did not want their protest to be taken over by people who, one, they don't like or they don't think have any credibility. The types of people that were out were not the usual opposition crowd that we have seen. They were the ordinary people from all ranks and all classes of Armenian life. And these are people that, in so many words, have had it with the country's inability to defend itself.
And Eric, there's a lot of talk swirling about sudden US engagement. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has spoken to Pashinyan twice now. He told Aliyev to cease hostilities. The US has also recognized that this was an attack on Armenia proper and that civilians were targeted. Most importantly, it is now very much speculated that it was the US that brokered the ceasefire that seems to be still holding. What do you think about all this talk about sudden US engagement?
Well, it's true. I think the United States stood out in its handling of this situation. I think I'm generally quite critical of US policies or their approach, but in this case, I must say this was what we're seeing from the United States, especially after yesterday's announcement about Nancy Pelosi. This is brilliant statecraft. They're essentially taking advantage of what is perceived to be the Russian clear betrayal of Armenia and trying to fill the vacuum and to see if they can use this opportunity to help the Russians triangulate themselves out of the Caucasus.
And I want to ask about this news, this surprise visit by US Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi. What did you think about this surprising development? And furthermore, what do you think America's interest game is at the moment?
This is a huge development. And I think it's somewhat not understood as a huge development for people who don't understand American politics. Nancy Pelosi is not technically, but in reality, the second most powerful person in the United States. and she's also has become a worldwide figure after the Taiwan visit. She is the daughter of the American establishment. She is far more than your normal speaker. In fact, our current American vice president is sort of a pupil or a protege of her. So her coming here is a humongous coup. It's a humongous event. And she is also, this is what's interesting here, is she is coming here this weekend. So the week in which Aliyev attacks Armenia, and the Russians refuse to abide by their treaty obligations. The second most important person in the United States is personally visiting Armenia. Now let's compare this to the other powers. They will be here at the same time where the Russian commission or whatever they've sent to figure out what happened, as if you need a commission to figure out what happened, is going to be here. So this is a complete humiliation for the Russian side. It's also a humiliation for the EU, is because despite the fact that there is a Western camp, they're not all the same. In fact, what we have learned in the last 6 months in Ukraine, in which many European countries, especially the Germans, would have been very gladly make a deal with the Russians to end this war. It was the Americans that have kept this war going for their own purposes, and they've essentially imposed their will, forcing the Europeans to take tremendous hits to their economy to essentially pursue US policies. So she's coming here at the same time where the Russian mission is here, and a few weeks after Ursula von der Leyen humiliates herself by flying to Baku to meet with Dracula about phony gas resources that don't exist. And the EU has been spending all this time in all these meetings, and they look like fools as much as the Russians do. So this is a complete brilliant power play, no matter what the intentions are. But the intentions are clear. The intentions are Putin has given them the stick. And I was speaking to a Russian scholar, someone who knows that country really well. He said that Putin might be undoing 200 years of Russian presence in the Caucasus over a period of 3 or 4 days. We don't know if this is the case, but it could be. When we look back at it in a couple of years or a couple of months, that's what happened.
And when looking at what happened in terms of the major attack in a larger context, Armenia's United Nations representative was warning delegates in New York that Azerbaijan is preparing further and larger attacks. Some believe that this may have been a small snippet of what's to come. Others say that it could have been, in fact, a massive strategic and military blunder on the part of Azerbaijan. What do you think about these two scenarios?
It's too early to tell, to have any definitive answers to it, because this is essentially, as you outlined, this is one of two scenarios. This could be what 2016, the 4-day war was to the 2020 war. It's the snippet, you figure out where the weaknesses are and what the world will tolerate, and then you go for it. It could be that. We don't know enough about the military facts to know if this was something very huge that got smashed in the face. We don't know that. Or maybe it was. So it's one of these two scenarios. The one thing that we do know, things like Mrs. Pelosi, the Speaker Pelosi coming here, because think about the context of this story that she's going to come here. She's going to bring the international press, and this is already being sold or perceived as she's coming to Armenia in solidarity.
Yes.
And someone of her stature, she's not going to Baku. So it could very well be that it might end up being a blunder on Ilhan's part, depending on how things work out. But at this point, we don't know enough to say either of these scenarios are definitively true. They could be they could be both true on some level, and they could be both wrong on some level.
And finally, Eric, questions are also being raised within Azerbaijani society. After 71 soldiers were killed on their side, including special forces, there were people on social media lamenting over Pelosi's announced visit. Some question why so many lives are being given. And also an Azerbaijani opposition figure, Ali Karamli, wrote this, I want to read out. What is lacking of the Azerbaijani army, or what caused 50 martyrs to be killed against an army of a psychologically weak, technologically backward and financially poor country? So what do you think about the perception in Azerbaijan? What do you think about?
Well, from everything that we know, the casualty figures are far greater than what they're announcing, just based on TikTok videos and other things. In fact, I believe that Aliyev declared a couple of days of national mourning. And the one thing that we know is that they lost significant numbers of officers and special forces, which were leading the attack. As far as Ali Karimli's statements, I'm hoping that what he's saying is what they sincerely believe, and it actually penetrates their country, that they believe that and they embrace it about who and what Armenians are, and what Armenia is. But furthermore, I think what's relevant in what he says is that this guy is supposed to be the liberal opposition. And instead of saying, why are we involved in a fascist war of aggression, he's complaining why the fascist war of aggression is costing us so many lives. Let me give you in comparison. Right now in Russia, there are hundreds, if not thousands of people in jail for protesting the war in Ukraine. You know, this is the opposition to Putin. Now, they might be a minority, but you see the class caliber difference, and it tells you much about the degradation of that society, that someone supposedly in the opposition thinks in these terms. It tells you what the Aliyev regime has created, this monstrosity and this wickedness of hate. And this has become it's their state, and it's obviously becoming their society.
Okay, Eric, thank you very much for your time.
It's a pleasure.
And continue following CivilNet on the latest on the situation in Armenia's south and east.